Today, I'm excited to welcome Arvind Nathan, founder of the Bitcoin Curve Substack, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Arvind.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. So before we get to Bitcoin, tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, where you grew up, and what you're up to now.
Cool. So I was born in Malaysia, but migrated to Australia as an infant. I think it was about 6 or 9 months old. And that was because my mother had studied in Australia, my dad studied in the States. And as you can imagine, my mother won any argument on where we were going to move to. So my parents chose to come down to Australia, which I think was one of the best decisions that they could have made for myself, because seeing a lot of my family over in Malaysia, I'll call it struggling with quality education, quality career prospects, and their own currency and their own economy, it was an awesome start to my life to have migrated to Australia. So thanks, Mum and Dad. In terms of host that, I'll call it the nerd of my high school. I ended up studying physics and mathematics at university, realizing I wasn't quite up to the requirements of math to do physics well. So I pivoted my career at that point and went into business, but focusing in on how to commercialize emerging technologies. So I've always been on this leading edge of technologies, and my career in the IT space, which is where most of my career has always been on the next thing that is going to revolutionize, I'll call it, IT systems. So it started with cloud computing in early 2010s. This is just as AWS was starting to gain momentum, but enterprises were yet to adopt. I was our cloud lead at Optus, which is the company I was working for at the time. Fast forward a couple of years, the term smart cities started to become a growing trend. At that point was when I was doing a lot of work in that space, both from a sales perspective in selling these solutions to governments and universities, but as well as a consultant. So I was part of a team that did some feasibility studies here in Australia on how a smart city could be brought to life and the value that it would be able to create. And this is where I started to dip my toe into the blockchain ecosystem. And I use blockchain ecosystem quite purposefully because it was not Bitcoin when I first started learning about this. It was Ethereum. Because at the time in smart cities, and by the way, Paula, pause me if you want to ask any questions or if I'm rambling. But at the time, Ethereum was very alluring to me as I was doing this feasibility work for smart cities, because one of the problems we were facing was about decentralized digital identity. Because when you think about a smart city, you're digitizing all the infrastructure, but to engage with that infrastructure, the city needed to know who you were, so that A, were you authorized to be able to use any of these digital services? And this could be things like bins, this could be things like smart spaces in libraries, access to meeting rooms, access to meeting equipment, and the use of that equipment. So you needed a way to identify people. And at the time, I was already starting to get concerned around privacy, because if a government was now in control of that identity and the use of all of this smart city technologies that they were offering to its citizens, they now had unparalleled, I call it, privacy intrusion, because they knew everything that you were about to do. So this is where I went to Ethereum, because as a smart contracts platform, it had more programmability to be able to do that digital identity at that point in time. And this is 2016, 2017 is the time frame that I'm talking about. And so I went down the Ethereum rabbit hole, and this is where I started to get really excited about blockchain, not because it was price go up and maybe I get rich, but because there was a utility aspect that was intersecting with the work that I was doing in smart cities. So it was really, really exciting. But then I stumbled into the problem with Ethereum. And this was, well, instead of a government now having a level of control or influence over identity and privacy, you now gave it to the Ethereum Foundation. And so while the blockchain element of Ethereum was very interesting in its ability to do this, the control that Vitalik and the Ethereum Foundation had over the blockchain and being able to unilaterally push changes to that system was what then scared me, because now you took the problem that was localized within a country, i.e. Australia, but now you expanded it to the world. So if I were to travel from Australia to, say, Malaysia, and Malaysia was also using Ethereum, now suddenly Vitalik or whoever was in control of this system may then be able to, in a later point, influence it to be able to track me globally rather than maintaining my privacy. So at this point, I was very turned off, and I saw the flaw of what Ethereum's promise, but Ethereum's flaws at the same time. Then you fast forward a couple of years, and the pandemic hits. So I went into hibernation mode on blockchain from 2017, and pandemic hits. Melbourne was the most locked down city in the world through the pandemic at 260 something days. I got reminiscence of privacy control issues that came from my Ethereum journey. And that's when I started to really go deep into Bitcoin. Did I want to say thousands of hours at this point, listening to every podcast, reading every book that I could that was of note. So I didn't read every book, but my three favorites are obviously the Bitcoin Standard. That's sort of a stock standard. The later one that came in was Broken Money by Lynn Alden. And then there was the Genesis book by Aaron von Weerdem, which talks about the history of the cypherpunk movement all the way into Bitcoin. Those three definitely cemented my view in Bitcoin. And here I am now starting my journey on contribution to the space, I'll call it, with the Bitcoin curve now that I've done the work, finding a bit of a niche that I think is untapped in the Bitcoin space with the work that I do on my Substack and soon to be video. So that's me. I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's a great beginning. I like that you mentioned the books. Did you read also The Price of Tomorrow, since you're a technology guy?
Not yet. So I've got this very, very long reading list that is on there, but unfortunately it's not quite up there. A lot of my Bitcoin curve research requires me to do a lot of reading, and it constantly adds and reprioritizes which book's going to go first. So it's on the list. I haven't quite gotten to it.
Well, we'll have you back when you read that. Just from listening to you, I often think about that book, because the way Jeff Booth comes to the Bitcoin space is also very different than most people. So once you found Bitcoin, I want to hear a little bit more about your journey. How did that go for you?
Yeah. So when I found it, it would have been, as I said, around that 2019, 2020, we're getting locked down. Number one, I had a lot of time, and we were doing a lot of house renovation work at the time. So I started that journey by having these headphones in my ears, listening to podcasts for about six hours a day. As I was doing gardening, as I was doing the work around the house, I'd just be listening to Bitcoin nonstop. So I'd say the most influential podcast at the time, just because of how accessible it made a very broad conversation, was the What Bitcoin Did podcast with Peter McCormack. It was by far the most accessible in that it was very, very broad. It wasn't so bullish onto Bitcoin. It did test, and I liked podcasts that tried to steelman the other side of the argument at times, but at the same point being very, very bullish on Bitcoin. So that started it. Then you start looking at all the price analysts. So a great one out of Australia is Checkmate. He does some great on-chain analytics, and so he's able to bring a very objective view to things as well. And as I started to see over that 2020, 2021 year, what I'd call a very mature conversation, in that it wasn't just about, hey, we've got this great internet money, it's going to replace fiat, it's going to be the best thing ever. What I was seeing was, hey, we've got this internet money created by this founder. It's tackling a lot of issues. We're starting to see proof points in our economy as to why this is going to work. I think that maturity in the space at that point really hooked me. And then you start going into the detail of, well, what makes this so brilliant as a technology to replace fiat as our reserve asset or our the money that we would use. And so then you start reading the white paper. Then you start understanding all the principles behind Bitcoin and what makes it so unique. Then you start diving into the fiat system. So the piece that really had me go all in was understand what is fiat and fiat monetary systems around the world. What is the reserve banking systems around the world? How are these systems manipulated in order to control the economy, both quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, and the use of the balance sheet of the reserve banks. And as I started to understand this system, then I started going down the rabbit hole of Austrian economics. Because then now you're sort of finding out about Keynesian economics in this fiat system, and you're saying, well, this doesn't quite make sense. Then you start hearing about Austrian economics, and now you're saying, oh, this makes a hell of a lot more sense. How the hell did we get to a reserve banking infrastructure if we knew what Austrian economics was? And then you start going down the rabbit hole of Austrian economics and principles. And the piece that was, I think, the cherry on the top, there is a lot of complexity within the fiat system. And to even understand how all of that works, it's very complex. And you start to see all of these, I'll call it experts that we listen to talk about how complex it is. And you need the experts, you need the PhDs to do all the work in order to figure out how to balance this economy. And then you come to Austrian economics, and it is incredibly simple. And you start to realize that in its simplicity, there is an element of beauty to it. But as well, because it was so simple, I realized that I wasn't having the wool pulled over my eyes. And so I saw the complexity as almost a veil to obscure my vision of what was actually occurring under an Austrian system. That veil was lifted and I could see everything quite clearly. And then you realize supply and demand as just the basic principle of everything. And you go back to first principles, and then that was the light bulb moment that this system had to collapse. There was no way that this could continue. And then we start to see the debt. And I'd say that journey that I just described probably took me through to 2021 also. Like it was about a 12-month, 15-month journey. And at that point, I started going all in and having the conversation with my wife and saying, we are allocating to Bitcoin. This is why. I brought her on the journey. And she was really good. While not a mathematician, she comes from a graphic design background and works in advertising, very much understood and was able to come on that journey with me. And so from about mid-2021 till now, so coming up to 2025 now, I've just been all in, because what I now see as a result of doing the work and understanding the world around me has made it very, very clear that Bitcoin is probably the only current solution we have to what is this fiat monetary system. So that's a bit more detail on the Bitcoin journey.
Do you think governments are aware that we are following this Keynesian economic system? And when I say governments, people in governments, or do you think it's just become such a habit many people don't even realize?
So I think our elected officials have got minimal clue to no clue. And the reason why I say that is they're elected, but they don't come from a financial background. They don't come from a position of understanding the economy, understanding finance, not to a deep level, to be able to come to the conclusion that I and maybe yourself have come to around why Bitcoin in this Keynesian system. But they have to rely on advice from the experts, the specialists, the advisors that surround them to help inform their thinking. Because, and I play not the devil's advocate, but I steelman their position as a politician and government bureaucrats as, I actually don't believe that people, or the majority of people, there are some, but the majority of people don't come into a job to try and swindle and do the wrong thing. Most come into it from a good place of trying to create change for the good. The challenge then becomes, which is, where do they get their information and what are their belief systems and why do those belief systems exist? And so you have to look at the education system saying why fiat money is good. And we don't even call it fiat. We don't even educate on fiat. So it's more of an omission of educational content rather than an inclusion of deceptive content. Then you go to, some of these elected officials may be plumbers. They may be business leaders. They may be technologists, whatever they may be. But they're not monetary theorists. So they have to get their information from somewhere. And those individuals, I think, is where you start to see some of the challenge occurring. I find it hard to believe that those within the reserve banks around the country, around the world, are oblivious to this difference between Keynesian and Austrian economics. They're the ones that largely are influencing and driving the system. So I find it hard to believe that they don't understand it and they don't know what they're doing. They may have staffers that don't, but the chairs of the reserve banks, etc., I would say would have to have their eyes open to the challenges of this system. It's their advice and other staffers' advice to these politicians that then drive policy and then regulation that keep us in this system because they don't know any better. So that's sort of my, if I were to steelman it, that would be my balanced view as to why government keeps pushing this system, is because they don't know any better. And the hope that I have here is when you see the movements, especially out of the US in this election cycle with, trying to remember what the party name is. I've had a mental blank.
The Republicans
Trump,
and the Democrats?
No. So Trump went to a rally and he was talking about firing Gary Gensler and the crowd erupted. I'm trying to think what was the Libertarian Party, the Libertarian movement.
Right.
So you've got libertarian movements now popping up around the world. You're seeing it getting a bit more mainstream attention on these libertarian principles, which are very much Austrian based on the monetary side, as well as small government as well. In the US, we have that same movement here in Australia, the Libertarian Party, that have very, very similar beliefs. They still need to catch up on the monetary theory element, but small government and small influence and control is definitely one of their pillars. And you're starting to see it around the world. You see Javier Milei coming in as an anarcho-capitalist. You see Nayib Bukele in El Salvador bringing in very similar grounded principles. So I see the light that we can start moving toward in this libertarian movement as a more mainstream political movement that gets us to this outcome and helps at least raise the conversation to the point where it can't be ignored, and force people to do the thinking and the research to help change the advice to some of these politicians that are otherwise oblivious. So there is hope. How long that is going to take to manifest in actual change is another thing, whether that's proactive change in our systems that leads us to be able to fix the damage that we've done, or whether it is we're not going to make it in time and then there's a system collapse and then there's a forcing of a change of the world order. I have no idea.
We shall see. Well, so Trump is running for the Republican Party. He might have some libertarian ideas, but he's still running for the Republican Party. And yes, RFK was more libertarian, but in this country, it's a two-party state. And that's basically how we are. You know, you talked about, just to comment on the people in government. I agree with you. They might go in with very good intentions, but when we are run on a fiat system, the incentives become too big once they get in. And it's so tempting to make the contract with the person who's going to give you the most money, or however it works. But it's very tempting once you get there, unfortunately. And like I've heard many people say, those closest to the money printer, it's very hard to say no.
Correct. Until you get to an event, a breaking point where the continuing of doing that, knowing just how catastrophic it's going to be, forces that change. And so I don't expect the change to occur until that point happens. And no one can actually predict when that point's going to come. I think I've listened to economists, even within the Bitcoin space, not know, is it going to be 10 years? Is it going to be 30 years? How long can this fiat Ponzi scheme keep going? Like, is it 100 trillion in debt? 150 trillion? Like, I actually don't know. Maybe there are people that can postulate on that. So it could be 10 years. It could be 50 years. But eventually you'll get to that point where they will force the change. And I know that we're not there yet because more recently, I just heard a speech from Trump, and it wasn't a speech, I think it was an interview, where he was saying that he was going to place tariffs on countries that were trying to exit the use of the US dollar around the world. So even he is holding on to it because he knows that without the US dollar, the US loses a significant amount of power globally. It's worse than any war, he said. So we are nowhere near that tipping point if someone like Trump is still gung-ho on the US dollar and sees it as the best path for US dominance globally. It means that we've not reached that tipping point. It's only to the point where continuing the US dollar is going to hurt US dominance. That's the point where I think you'll start to see the politicians emerge to say we need a better way. In the same way that Nayib Bukele has been buying one Bitcoin a day. And I haven't actually checked to see if he's actually done that consistently, but I'm assuming that he has at this point, paying down his debts. He's reached that tipping point. Argentina reached that tipping point. I'm sure from where you are on the African continent, there are probably going to be a lot of countries that have reached the tipping point, just don't have the tools in order to drive change. But the US is nowhere near it. Australia is nowhere near it. Most of Europe is nowhere near it. And so we'll see.
Yeah, so I'm in Miami, but I'm originally from Zimbabwe. So I follow both. So on your Substack, you have some wonderful articles, and you said that you got started researching on how to scale Bitcoin beyond money. And many people don't see Bitcoin as money, especially in the Western world, right? We see it more of a store of value. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I will agree that absolutely we're currently at the store of value stage, but there are stages in which you need to get an asset before it becomes a money. And I think Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, articulates that far better than I could ever on a podcast. So we're at store of value, but eventually we'll get to a medium of exchange. And whether that's in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, pick your time horizon, as adoption starts to increase and this becomes a widely adopted asset by the population, and it starts to get some stability in its value, because we're still in the adoption phase, so there's still a risk on asset from that perspective, in that we haven't quite adopted it yet. Once it becomes stable, because we're at 70+% population adoption within countries, that's when you could probably start to see it more as a medium of exchange, because the trade-off of value appreciation of the asset is going to be less than the freedom of using it as a medium of exchange gives you. And so when you get that benefit tipped toward it allowing you to exit a system by using it as a medium of exchange, tips over the capital appreciation that the asset has, I think personally that that's where it will start to shift to a medium of exchange. Because even when I think about my own Bitcoin holdings, I don't want to spend any of it. I'm earning fiat from my jobs and whatnot. I just want to convert it into Bitcoin and hodl it. But I could see a point where if I knew the price was relatively stable within a couple of percentage points over a 6-month period, absolutely I would. Because I'd rather not be at the whims of a Visa or a MasterCard clipping 1% and 2% of my transaction fee, because I'm actually losing that purchasing power to middlemen. At that point, that's where the break even for me is, and I'd start using Bitcoin as a broader medium of exchange. So we'll get there. Where the research around it extending beyond that final phase of Bitcoin being money came from was I tried to think about what would a world be on a Bitcoin standard and what would likely occur at that point. Because as I was going through Bitcoin's principles, there was always something in the back of my head that didn't feel quite right, in that it didn't explain why Bitcoin is being so successful. Yes, it's decentralized. Yes, it's proof of work, and it's got all of these features that lead to outcomes. But there was something in the back of my mind that kept telling me, you haven't gone quite deep enough. And when I went deep enough, I realized that each of these, and this leads to my thesis in the Bitcoin curve, is that Bitcoin's not successful because it's code and that it's proof of work and that it's decentralized, etc. It's because these features are limiting these human behaviors that act in opposition to our long-term prosperity. And I characterize these behaviors as effectively the 7 deadly sins. So when we start to think about, what does decentralization actually do? Well, it minimizes greed and gluttony by a select few middlemen that clip the ticket on things that they don't deserve and overconsume beyond what they need. And if you think about proof of work, it's fighting the sin of sloth, the aversion to doing work. Proof of work forces you to do the work, and so creates a barrier for you to be able to minimize that sin from manifesting in itself. Because I think what religion has taught us, and there is wisdom in religion from history, has told us that humans don't always act in our best interest long term, and we often do in short term. And what Bitcoin does is force us to effectively close the door on our ability to express those sinful behaviors. I call them adverse human behaviors. And that's when it clicked to me and saying, okay, I understand now. It's actually tapping into and solving for human psychology and human behavior more so than actually money. And when I came to that realization and I envisioned what we looked like on a Bitcoin standard, I asked the question, is human behavior going to instantly change just because we're on a Bitcoin standard? And I said, absolutely not. I don't think we've ever been able to control for that human behavior, which is why we need a rules-based system around us to stop us from doing things that are in our best interests, but at the detriment of this community and the society around us. And so these bad actors that are currently within our fiat system taking advantage of it, do I believe that on a Bitcoin standard, they're going to say, hey, I've learnt the error of my ways. I'm going to become a reformed citizen. I'm going to do everything the best I can. And the likelihood is maybe some of them, but most of them probably not. What they're going to do is they're going to try and find the easy way out, the sinner sloth, the aversion to doing work. They're going to find the easiest exit ramp to maintain their greed, their gluttony, their sloth, wrath, envy, lust. They're going to go to the easiest way out. And that is going to manifest itself in other industries. So yes, Bitcoin will be the base layer of money. Great. But what about our education systems, healthcare systems, political systems, infrastructure? All of these are still run by people who have created systems in order to run those industries. So we take healthcare, and you're seeing the Maha movement now with RFK, with Trump largely showcasing what the health systems look like. Now imagine a system where these companies that are perverting our healthcare, instead of stacking fiat and spending that in order to gain control and dominance, they start stacking sats. Now, I think eventually merit plays out, but there is an avenue here where they are able to control more of the supply of Bitcoin at that point. And it's not going to be a huge amount, but enough to be able to bully the competition with capital reserves in Bitcoin, bullying competition, undercutting markets to keep people out of the system so they could maintain the gravy train of profits. So in that theory, then every system is then at risk of these bad actors then shifting to all these other areas, and instead of stacking fiat, they start stacking sats. But because I'd already come to my initial hypothesis, it's not quite a conclusion yet because I don't think I've done the work yet to justify that through proper research, and that's the goal of the Bitcoin curve. My goal with this is to say, well, we're solving for human behavior, not necessarily for money, because we're solving for those sins. How do we take the learnings of how Bitcoin has been so successful so far with money and create a blueprint that we can then provide the entrepreneurs in the healthcare, in education, to people working within political systems? How do we give them a blueprint and a framework to show how you could take the success of Bitcoin for money and scale it into other industries so that as we shift to a Bitcoin standard, these exit ramps to express this corrupt kind of behavior are proactively closed so that we can ensure that the entirety of our civilization is benefiting from a Bitcoin ethos rather than having the money solved for and then realizing, oh, we haven't fixed everything else. We've still got these challenges and it's going to take another 50 years, 100 years to now unwind all of that. So that's the reason behind I call it the tagline, scaling Bitcoin beyond money, because I'm looking for the problem when we're on a Bitcoin standard, not necessarily just looking at how do we drive toward a Bitcoin standard.
So I hear what you're saying. Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. It doesn't fix all the bad actors. But I also hear in you that you care about the little guy. And some of your articles, you've mentioned how Bitcoin is going to help people further away from the money printer and countries like in Africa and South America. Tell us, what is it in you that cares about that?
It's a bit hard to describe. I just look at it as, I'd say that the majority of people actually do care about their fellow citizen. And if you experience the world and you take it from the lens of empathy, it's very hard to ignore it and then to say, am I a good person if I ignore it and just look after myself? And I always get the feeling that I know, and I do this little experiment where I picture myself, hopefully well into the future on my deathbed, looking back at my life and saying, do I have any regrets? And the conclusion I always come to in relation to this is, if I didn't try, then I would have that regret on my deathbed, and I would hate for that to be the last thought before I passed on. And so I use that as a bit of a litmus test to say, am I doing the right thing? And there are a couple of life examples that help me build that. So number one, I was raised in a Hindu household, and my father always told me religion is a way of life. It's a way to live a virtuous life, one that you can be proud of. So that sort of set the foundation. And religious principles are very much toward giving and charity and ensuring that you are doing right by not just yourself in the eyes of God, but also within the community in which you live. Then when I went to India, and this was after my father passed, and I was scattering his ashes in the Ganges, you walk through the slums of India. Now, this wasn't a big slum. This was kind of the north of India where it wasn't that big, but just even walking through a small one, and you see how people are living, and then you reflect and you say, well, I'm living in a house in Australia that is probably the size of what 10 to 20 families are living in here in India. Open air, there's barely any amenities, and yet I have all that prosperity and they don't. That disparity, when you're faced with it, also opens your eyes up to it. So that was probably another sort of a dot along the path. My brother-in-law has autism, and so I know that when you're looking after someone with a disability as well, again, there's a compassionate element. If you were cold, you'd say, well, you know what, it is what it is. I'm just going to move on with my life. But in humanity, there is an immense amount of compassion for your fellow human being that drives us to want to look after those that are less fortunate than our own. And I see that in looking after my brother-in-law that does have a disability. Now, he has a great life now, and we always hope that he's happy. But that as well also drives to it. All of this has led me to do some board work. So I sit on as a non-executive director on company boards, but always in the non-profit space. So I've always done it in, the first company was in mental health, the second company is in disability. So I've always been exposed to it. And the more that you get exposed to it and you don't close your eyes to, you can call it injustice, inequality, inequity. I think it's just, unfortunately, a natural part of our human systems as it stands today, and maybe there's a better path forward. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's the Bitcoin ethos. Maybe that helps this. But having constantly been exposed, constantly keeping my eyes open, constantly being able to feel and put myself in the shoes of those people gives me that drive to say, I think I will be far more fulfilled in trying to drive a system and an ethos that better reflects humanity's compassion than what we're currently seeing is an ethos driving humans' affinity to greed, and that greed manifesting in the fiat system, and it's only by a few. And so it's not a scathing review on humanity as a whole. I think it's a scathing review on the systems that we've put in place and allowed the few to pervert, that has led to a lot of what we're seeing. So I think that's probably the why behind it, and it's just a bit more natural to me.
Well, that's a beautiful reason. You know, since I've started doing this, every Bitcoiner almost that I've spoken to, as they go down the rabbit hole, they care more about not only their own lives and getting healthier and having more hope for the future, but also about the rest of the world and having a fairer place, a fairer planet. From every country that I've spoken to care about that. So I do see Bitcoiners as wonderful people. And, you know, you mentioned proof of work. And since I started doing this, I'm also tending to go more into the Bitcoin space because that's what I like doing. I want to spread the word. I wasn't loving my job anymore, which is in real estate. And so instead of spending more, I cut down my spending and am spending more time in the Bitcoin space. I just think of Jeff Booth when I say this, because what he did was completely got off every single board in a fiat system. He only works with Bitcoin companies. He only invests in Bitcoin. He's not even on Twitter X anymore because he is living that way. And I try to emulate that a little bit more. I think it helps if you're completely financially free, right? To live completely on a Bitcoin standard. But I am doing my best to live the life that and in the world that I want to see.
And I think the Jeff Booth example is a good one in going all in a very meaningful way to be that example to others as to how it can be done and sticking by your principles. But I think that there is also many different ways. So you could be only on the board of Bitcoin companies and only operate on a Bitcoin standard. The problem is the rest of the world isn't quite there yet, and there are a lot of people still stuck elsewhere. And you still need voices on the boards of companies on a fiat standard under these systems in order to be the voice of dissent, in order to drive a meaningful discourse to shift people as well. So Jeff is one example, and there'll be people that have a natural affinity toward that lifestyle to live what they teach and what they say. And then there'll be a class, and I put myself in this. I won't go on 100% Bitcoin only world, knowing that there'll be a lot of other people left behind. So my intent is to say, if my North Star outcome is to drive this Bitcoin ethos, not standard, but ethos beyond money, etc., then I need to be in that system campaigning with the proof of work and value return on doing it to help everyone around us understand and then transition themselves across as well. And so I expect to be in there as much as possible. But where I can, I'll go to the Bitcoin standard. So if I can, for example, with the Bitcoin curve, we're still in our, I'll call it building phase. I've only done about 3 months worth of research publications so far. I've got a multi-year horizon for this venture, but let's just say in 12, 18 months, I decide to turn this into a commercial enterprise. My balance sheet will be Bitcoin. It's not going to be fiat, as an example. And I'll be very clear that it is very much Bitcoin only, where vendors and suppliers to myself willing to accept Bitcoin, I will pay in Bitcoin and in sats for services. And I will receive Bitcoin where I can from people that want to do that as well, to help incentivize them and teach them how to do it. And I will ensure that companies that I engage with in the B2B element of this enterprise, that is trying to drive large institutions and businesses towards this ethos, I will try to get them to add an allocation of their balance sheet into Bitcoin, which, by the way, I think is going to naturally happen with the ETFs. So I'd say that I'm similar to Jeff in living the principles, but in a very, very different way.
And when do you think that'll happen for you?
Going commercial?
Well,
or trying to...
Going to work full-time on your Substack.
Oh, well, I'm hoping for a 12-month horizon, starting effectively at the start of October. I had a 12-month period of time where I still work full-time in order to maintain wife, house. I got a child on the way as well. So
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So I've still got a lot of responsibilities that mean that I can't quite go 100% into it. But I've got a 12-month program of work, and the intent is provide everything free at the moment and build an audience and see whether or not what I'm looking into is actually valuable to the market. Because at the end of the day, I might think it's a great idea, but if the market and the people around me don't, then so be it. It is what it is. The market is decided, and that's the merit-based element of it, and I'm very open to that. But it needs 12 months. And I think at a bare minimum before I figure out, is this thing going to work or not? So maybe we'll check back in a year's time at this point and see, have we built the audience? Have we built the interests? And is there a commercial future for it? And at that point, I would hope to make the call, yes, let's go all in, or no, let's continue for another 12 months because we haven't quite hit it. I need to iterate a little bit. I need to better address what the people actually want, what the industry actually wants, and then move from there.
Well, it definitely seems like you're on the right path. Like you said, for me, when I saw your information, there's great information. It's just a matter of getting people to know it's there. Not enough people know about you.
Yeah, no, correct. And part of that is I've not invested the time to doing social channels and whatnot. So I've now found someone to help me on that front, just because I know that my strength is doing the research, coming up with some of those insights, and I want to focus as much of my time doing the reading, doing the thinking, and then the writing. And eventually I'll start doing video as well for my articles, because I know reading long form articles isn't everybody's cup of tea. So I've realized that, and I know if I'm going to go all in on this, I needed the help. So I've brought someone to do all of the social elements, to take the content that I create and make it into bite-sized pieces and publish it onto all the platforms and start to build that audience. And that's what this first 12 months is about. It's research as much as possible, build as much as possible, communicate as much as possible, see what works, and we'll go from there.
On your Substack, you wrote an article on the S-curve and how we orange pill people going forward. Can you talk a little bit about those two?
Absolutely. So this is actually a series of articles that are about to come out over the next month or two, which tie two concepts together. So the first one is technology adoption curves, because that's what ultimately Bitcoin is currently on. When you look at technology adoption, you'll see it in usually two different types of graphics. The first one is an S-curve, and people talk about the S-curve for the internet and S-curve of the microwave, etc. And you sort of see it, if I sort of do it here, it's like a bit of an S-curve. The other one you also see is a bell curve, but they both articulate the exact same thing. It talks to the adoption of a technology segmented by a population cohort. It starts off with, and they all have very, very different tendencies as a group. So you start off with the innovators. These are people that will always try the brand new thing, push the envelope on things, and are willing to take massive risks on things. That's about 2.5% of the population. You then get your early adopters, which is from that 2.5% or 3% or whatever it is up to about 16% of the population of adoption. These early adopters, not quite the innovators, but are risk takers, are willing to give something a go, and that takes us to about that 16% of the total population, or what I should say is of the addressable market that the technology is looking to solve for. So in the case of Bitcoin, it's the entire world's population. But in other technologies, it may only be a subset, but we're talking about a percentage of the addressable market size. At this 16% mark, and it's rough numbers, you could be 15, 14, could be 17, 18, but at this point, you're now starting to shift away from the early adopters to the early majority. And this is where you're now starting to find your everyday person looking to adopt this, that aren't quite early adopters, innovators, and having a high risk tolerance, but they're going to want to see proof points of, what does this technology actually do? Is it going to be valuable for me? Do people say that it's being valuable for them, solving the problem that I have? And this is from that 16% to 50%. So this is a very, very large population sample. When you shift from that first 16% now to this early majority, we face what's known as the technology adoption chasm. And this chasm exists because making that jump from that 16% to the mass market is very, very hard, because you're no longer looking at just a simplistic version of the technology that's addressing an innovative solution to a problem. You're now trying to contextualize that solution to a very, very broad audience. And in the case of Bitcoin, this will look like people like us. I would call us in the early adopters, because we're nowhere near that 16% globally.
Where are we?
So it depends. So globally, I think we're below 8% at the moment. And the data is a bit old from what I produced on the Substack in my analysis. The problem with it is we don't have a lot of data sources to validate whether or not the percentages that are being put forward are accurate, but directionally, it's probably accurate in saying the trend of where we are. So globally, we're nowhere near the 16%. But what becomes interesting is when you go on a country by country basis to see where individual countries are on that journey. Because when you looked at the internet's adoption in the late 90s and the early 2000s, on the whole, was relatively low globally. But there were countries that were way advanced in their journey. So as an example, the African continent would have been at 1% of internet adoption, while the Nordic countries in the US were already at 45% adoption. And that makes a lot of sense, because the infrastructure wasn't in place in Africa in order to allow for internet at the time. There was just no fiber in the ground, there was no copper in the ground in order to allow for that. Whereas developed countries already had a lot of that infrastructure in place with the telephony systems. So because of that disparity, you had some countries in the early majority adoption phase that required a very, very different approach in comparison to Africa or parts of Asia, and China and India were in that cohort as well. The reason why I bring this up now is, first, you understand the adoption curve to understand what kind of audience are you now trying to bring on board. Because if your country, as an example, is only at 2% population adoption, then you're still targeting a conversation for the early early minority, which is still high risk takers willing to take a punt on a technology that's solving a problem. So your conversation and the people you're trying to find are very different. Whereas if you're already at that 16 to 17 to 18% mark, this is where you are now about to cross the chasm. And you need to start to shift the way in which you communicate about it to achieve resonance with a community of people that are very, very different. And the reason why understanding that is so important is in each of our countries around the world, we're going to be at different stages. So as an example, the US is at 16% at the moment. So the US is in the chasm. And when you look at US and this is a crypto adoption, but it talks to a likelihood of adoption of Bitcoin more broadly, because they're already talking about big blockchain more broadly. The US is in that chasm. And so now it's less about price go up with the crypto bros or the Bitcoin ethos on a Austrian economics and fixing the monetary system. When you think about the average person, they're not going to care about the monetary system per se. What they're going to care about is, how am I going to put food on the table for my family because I've been working 12 hours a day trying to work 2 jobs to make a living? It's going to be the nurses that are constantly faced with trauma on a day-to-day basis, that when they want to come home, they don't want to be learning about a fiat system. They're just trying to decompress from what is a very emotionally taxing day. And you could think about a type of individual and the work that they do, and you can realize why they're not going to invest the time. So actually what we're needing to do now in some of these countries is shift the conversation to, well, what does this enable you to achieve, and what problem is it solving for your life? And which is why I think on a previous podcast, I was saying we need 10, 15, 20 times the amount of podcasts, but targeted at a cohort of people that might resonate with a much smaller audience. That is plumbers, that is nurses, that is doctors, that is engineers, that is IT professionals, that is lawyers, that is government bureaucrats. Because if you can have more tailored conversations to what Bitcoin does for them and why they need to care about it and what they're going to get from it, eventually through the conversations like the ones that we're having now, it's going to be articulated in a way that just clicks. It's like, I've heard this so many times before, but just that one time articulated in that way just sort of landed in my mind in a way that just resonated. We need to create more of those moments. And as we cross the chasm into this early majority of adoption, my belief is that we need to have more tailored conversations. In the same way that we saw podcasts explode and target specific audiences, that's what Bitcoin now needs to do. And so this is the whole point around technology adoption curves, and then crossing this chasm, which is the next series of articles. It's about being able to understand where you are in that journey in your geography and what you now need to think about. But I'm going to take it a step further, which is I'm going to start profiling the countries that are well ahead on their adoption journey. So these are Argentina's, I think, above 20-something%. Singapore's in there. Thailand's in there. The UAE is in there. They're all going to have success stories as to what made their technology adoption cross that chasm into, I'd call it that mainstream adoption. That countries that are about to hit that point can learn from them to understand what was resonating and why in that population, and seeing whether it's relevant for theirs. So as an example, if you're in Thailand and you're already at 20-something%, there's a good chance that if you're in Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, that there's going to be similarities in the challenges that population is going to be facing. So you may want to look at Thailand as a use case as to why. If you're in South America, you'll probably have very similar challenges that Argentina is having. And you might want to start learning from the conversations that they're having in Argentina to inform how you structure your value proposition for Bitcoin for your audiences. Is name your South American country. If you're in a developed Asian country, more so than what I just talked about, which I would think is like Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe China to a degree, but China's a bit of a interesting, unique case and they may not get there. You might want to follow Singapore. If you're in the United Middle East, you'd look to, well, why was the UAE so far ahead? And how do we use their conversation? And on the flip side, if you're in a country that's only at 4% adoption, so look at India, I think they're at about 4% at the moment, you might need to take a look at all of these countries as to what conversations got them from 4 to 16%. It's helping you identify where you are, what you should look for, and it'll be a segmented by population, psychographics, demographics view of these countries that are further ahead, these countries that are not quite there, to provide a bit of a guide on how to structure a conversation, how to structure a value proposition so that you can minimize the time to adoption, de-risk the adoption as well, so that we can bring more people on this journey. And I'll just also say the reason why I think this is so important over the next 12, 24, 36 months is because we're now starting to see larger institutions entering into the space. So we've always said in the Bitcoin space that this is the greatest asset because for the first time in modern history, retail is able to front run the institutions. But that window of time of front running institutions is now closing very, very, very quickly. And so the faster that we can de-risk the conversations and the communication of the value of Bitcoin to underrepresented countries around the world, my mind automatically goes to parts of Asia, Africa, South America, maybe parts of Western Europe. The faster that we can get their understanding of why Bitcoin relevant to them, the more time they have to start shifting their wealth or a portion of their wealth into Bitcoin so that they can also front run the institutions. So I look at it, the reason why I think it's important is not because of Bitcoin, it's because of those who are going to get access to this opportunity. And I'd rather it not be the institutions and I'd rather it be the general public, which is why I think it's important. And those articles will be coming out in the next couple of months.
That was a wonderful explanation. The only thing that I would add, what I was thinking when you were saying, yes, there's only going to ever be 21 million. So there's limited amount. Price and pain often bring people in. Price going up and pain in their life. And the one thing about African countries and Asian countries and South America, the inflation is high and brings them pain. So we're hoping that they find it, as you mentioned before, it gets out of control.
100%.
So we're coming to the end, and yep. I didn't get too many questions, but just want to ask you, how has Bitcoin changed you?
It has changed me, I'd call it fundamentally. And the reason why I say fundamentally is this ethos of Bitcoin and how it has opened my eyes to the world around me. I come back to that veil. For the first almost 30 years of my life, I had this veil over my eyes as to what I thought the world was. Bitcoin has then lifted that veil and given me a very new perspective. And I'd almost say that it's changed my worldview to a degree as well on the world and our civilization and society more broadly. And it has driven action in me that I don't think that I would have had in the past. And a great example of this is I've tried entrepreneurship in the past with some consultancies, but each one, when I reflect on it, has always been driven by money. This is the first time that something has opened my eyes up to the point where I don't care about the money as much, outside of just keeping the lights on, food on the table, making sure that my family are well looked after. But I don't have that same commercial drive that I did. And the fact that now that I've gotten to that point where I've found that is the power of what Bitcoin has done for me. It's completely changed my worldview. And it's also better linked my upbringing religiously, the principles and values that religion brings, even though I'm not practicing anymore, but brought it into this this modern context of how it applies in life today. It's given me an element of hope. It's given me a level of optimism as well as about what could be. It's shown a path forward as to how you could achieve it as well, and then driven more altruistic, more selfless behaviors out of me naturally than I otherwise would not have been able to see in the first sort of 13 years of my career. So fundamentally changed me in many ways. And I'd say elevated the better parts of my thinking at the same time.
What a wonderful thing. That's why we want more Bitcoiners.
100%.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Arvind.
Not a problem. And I'm looking forward to the next one. Could probably dive into a few of those other questions as well.
You're going to be a full-time Bitcoiner by then. Well, full-time
Absolutely.
Bitcoin company.
Yep. Hopefully.